And now that I've got 30 episodes in the books, let's take a look back at episodes 21 through 30 and see if I have any additions, corrections, and any other things that might have happened along the way. We start off with episode 21, talking about US 192. I don't think I can really do justice, and I didn't do justice, to just what it took to get from South Florida to the Walt Disney World Resort. You had to come up the Florida Turnpike, and then you had to cut across US 192 to get into the theme park, going along World Drive. And it was always interesting. There were so many honky-tonk things and so many interesting things to see. It was totally memorable. US 192 cuts right through the land that Earl Bronson once owned. So it has this historical significance in addition to being the one way to get into the theme parks if you were coming from the south. This was a really interesting kind of place because it really encapsulated everything that was Central Florida before Walt Disney World came, and then really what Walt Disney World became after that. There were also some of the construction facilities and some of the other sites that were there along US 192 as you went up toward the resort. There was a number of places there that were historically significant to Disney, and Disney still owns to a large degree, so it's kind of interesting to look at them as you drive along. Episode 22, the other hotel sites. Disney had planned for a much broader sense of community, to have more hotels on property and do more things, but unfortunately they never got built. Disney World Phase 2 never really got off the ground, but it was interesting to see what they had in mind. Now, of course, there are hotels in a lot of the spaces that were originally planned for other hotels. Not all of them, but it's interesting to see how they've developed up and what they've done in those spaces over time to not be exactly what they had in mind when they were building the Walt Disney World Resort. I do have to wonder sometimes what it might have been like had those hotels been built. Would the whole property be different? Would it have a different feel to it? I'm not really sure. Episode 23, Dino Sue. In this video cast, I'm not sure that I gave quite enough of the backstory. The backstory is that Sue Hendrickson was a paleontologist working in South Dakota, and there was a fortuitous thing that happened that she got a flat tire, and they decided to dig on some land that was near where the flat was. And so she and her group started digging, and they actually came upon the skeleton. The skeleton was an interesting find in that it was an almost complete T-Rex as they dug it out. Beyond that, there's a little more to this story that I actually didn't get into, and that has to do with what happened after they excavated the dinosaur. There was a lot of legal interplay between the indigenous Indian tribe in the area, the purported landowner, and the person who had obtained the rights to be able to excavate on that property. In the legal proceeding, basically the person who was the landowner, in conjunction with the Indian tribe, had said that they granted the rights to dig there, but not to take anything out. Essentially what they were saying was that if anything was found on that property, they would have to negotiate a new agreement. This got tied up in the court system for several years, when finally it was decided that the landowner had the rights to do what they wanted with that skeleton, even though the paleontologists had dug it out and invested their time and effort into it. Anyway, the landowner decided that they were going to make money on it and sell it through the Sotheby's auction. The paleontologists were attached to or loosely tied to the Field Museum in Chicago, which wanted to obtain the bones to put on display. But they didn't have deep enough pockets to be able to make the purchase. So they put a call out to all the companies and organizations that they knew that might be interested in investing in it as part of a greater effort. There were several companies that stepped forward, but two of note, the McDonald's Corporation and the Walt Disney Company. They actually decided to answer the call and give money to actually win the auction. The fear was that if this auction wasn't won by the Field Museum, it would probably wind up in a private collection somewhere, meaning the public would never get to see it. So it made a lot of sense for these companies to work together to try and make sure that it wound up in a public display somewhere. From there, I think I did a pretty good job of explaining the story. It was just, how did we get to this point was kind of the interesting stumbling block that I missed out on. Episode 24 was about Downtown Disney. I don't know if I expressed well enough in my video cast that Downtown Disney was really what Epcot was all about at the time that the Walt Disney Company broke ground and started constructing what they had there, and they were going to build the Magic Kingdom and a few other things around it. Downtown Disney, the Disney Village Marketplace, was going to be that one thing that was going to represent Epcot to a large degree and sort of be the test case. The Disney company had no idea how to deal with Epcot without Walt in the picture, but they had an idea that they wanted to create something that would sort of encapsulate it between homes, between apartments, between a convention center, between a sort of a research park. They were going to create something that might encapsulate some portion of what Epcot was while they figured it out. Of course, it never became that, but it's interesting in the historical context how that came to be. In episode 25, I talk about Pleasure Island. In the 1990s, Disney was starting to grow, and they called it the Disney Decade. They were growing and a lot of things were happening. But the one thing they wanted to do was make sure that they kept people on Disney property so that you wouldn't want to leave. You'd have no reason to. There were a couple of other places that were opening up. Universal Studios was starting to build out their City Walk. They hadn't built it yet, but they had this idea for it. It was already on paper and already been announced. There was a place called Church Street Station that was in downtown Orlando, and there were a few other hot spots around where people could go for dining and entertainment in the evenings after the theme parks closed. So Disney figured out they could get in this game by creating something called Pleasure Island. And that's kind of how it all got started. Now, the interesting part was it was a victim of its own success. It became so successful that they actually started drawing a lot of locals to come there regularly. And so people in their late teens and early 20s, people around the end of high school, maybe early in college would come over there, and it changed the dynamic of the crowd. And it became a little bit harder to keep it up and make sure that it had the quality that they wanted to have. So ultimately, Disney decided that they had to close it. Episode 26, the Land Pavilion Mural. This is one of the more interesting things at Disney. It's so subtle, most people just walk past it. It's a really interesting mural that depicts everything about the Earth in an abstract sort of way, and it kind of goes up into the building, and I show that in the video cast how that works. I don't think I really missed anything here. I think this one kind of covered a lot of ground in the sense of the story I was telling. Episode 27, Walts Trains. I find this really interesting that a couple of actual cars that Walt Disney had rode on and used in his backyard railroad, his Carrollwood and Pacific Railroad, are on display here at the Wilderness Lodge. And they're just tucked away, but they're on display. It's really kind of a neat thing that you can walk in and see and actually get up close to. And I find that really interesting. Walt Disney loved trains, there's no question about it. Ward Kimball helped him build the trains, and they had a really interesting time with it. And here's this connection to Disney history that's right there in front of us, and I love that. Episode 28 was about the Crossroads. The Crossroads, I think I did it enough justice to talk about how Disney was trying to grow out some other things as you think about that 1990s era when they were thinking about how to use their land and what they could do. They needed a few things that were closer to Disney property that had like a shopping center where you might have a grocery store and a few other amenities that you don't have otherwise. It's kind of interesting how it's changed over the years, and it still looks like the DOT is on track to actually take it over at some point, but that date is still somewhere distant in the future and no one knows when it'll actually happen. Episode 29, Western Way. I'll be honest, I think this is one of my weakest video casts of all of the ones that I've done to this point. But I wanted to show what the original Disney looked like, what the property looked like before Walt Disney got there. And this is the only way you can still see it to a large degree, because this piece of land, the stretch of land over in this area, is still the undisturbed, very similar to the way it was in the 1960s, early 1970s, and it kind of has that feel to it. And eventually it's going to be more developed and have perhaps a theme park on it, perhaps just shopping and dining and more experiences and things there. Hard to say, but when it does, it loses that charm of the original Florida. And I wanted to make sure we didn't miss that in the discussion of what the Walt Disney World property looked like in the late 1960s. Episode 30, River Country. River Country is an interesting place. I was thinking about it the other day and I realized, I remember going there, but I can't remember anything specific about it. I was thinking about little things about it that I kind of remember, but I can't remember anything very specific. And it's kind of interesting that way because it was a good old-fashioned swimming hole, but there was nothing about it that was really that interesting, compelling, that kind of a thing. You'd stay on Disney property, you might go over there for part of a day to cool off and have some fun, and it was kind of fun. But I don't remember anything about it that was just so compelling where I was like, wow, that's awesome. I totally remember that. And there you go. That's episodes 21 through 30 of my video cast. I hope you're enjoying these. I have many more planned that I'll be continuing to work on. So please, if you have any ideas and anything you'd like to see, just post below and I'll be happy to consider them.